The gun was already drawn when Louisa Hart walked through the door of the Donovan ranch, and it was pointed straight at her chest. She did not flinch. She had crossed 1,100 miles of open country, buried her sister in a shallow grave outside of Abilene, lost her horse to a rattlesnake 3 days east of the Pecos River, and walked the last 14 miles in boots that had worn clean through the soles. She was not about to flinch at a gun. The man holding it was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at his temples from sweat, and eyes the color of a winter sky just before a hard storm rolled in. He looked at her like she was the last person on earth he expected to see standing in his doorway, and like he was trying to decide whether her arrival was a blessing or the worst kind of betrayal. "State your business," he said, and his voice was low and rough like gravel under wagon wheels. Louisa set down her saddlebag. It landed on the floorboards with a dull, tired thud. She squared her shoulders and looked him dead in the eyes and said, "My name is Louisa Hart. I've come from Ohio." "I believe you were expecting me." The silence that stretched between them was not empty. It was full of everything that had gone wrong, everything that still could, and something else entirely that neither of them had names for yet. He lowered the gun slowly. His jaw was tight. His eyes moved over her, taking in the dust that had caked into the creases of her neck, the torn hem of her dress, the raw red blisters on her hands where she had gripped a rope bridle for 3 days straight after her saddle broke. He looked at the saddlebag on his floor, the only possession she had in the world, and then he looked back at her face. "You were supposed to arrive 2 months ago," he said. "I know," Louisa said. "I assumed you weren't coming. I know. I wrote to cancel the arrangement." Louisa reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded letter, creased from being read too many times in the dark. She held it out to him. "The letter arrived after I had already gone," she said. "I didn't get it. My neighbor sent it on to me on the road, but by then I was already past Dodge City and I had no way to turn back even if I had wanted to." He stared at the letter in her hand for a long moment. He did not take it. "Why would you have no way to turn back?" he asked. And that was the question that opened everything up, the question that required her to reach all the way back to the beginning of what had brought her here, to the dark past she had been running from and the desperate hope she had been running toward. Louisa Hart had been born 26 years earlier in a small town outside of Columbus, Ohio, the second daughter of a schoolteacher father and a mother who had died of fever when Louisa was 9 years old. Her father, Thomas Hart, had been a good man in the soft, ineffectual way that good men sometimes are, and after her mother's death, he had retreated into his books and his grief and left the raising of Louisa and her older sister Clara to themselves and to each other. Clara had been the one who kept them fed, who mended their dresses, who learned to barter eggs for flour at the general store. Clara had been fierce and practical and funny, with a laugh that could fill a room. Louisa had been the one who read everything she could find, who memorized the almanac and the newspaper and every letter that came through their small town from the West, where the land was wide open and a person could become whoever they chose. It was Clara who had first seen the advertisement in the Ohio Farmer's Friend, tucked between notices for seed grain and a cure for hoof rot. It was a brief, practical notice placed by a man named John Donovan of Sweetwater Creek, New Mexico Territory, who owned 400 acres of cattle land and required a capable, honest woman willing to relocate to the frontier to serve as a wife and partner in the running of his household and ranch. The advertisement had made no romantic promises. It had listed requirements: good health, practical skills, willingness to work hard. It had listed what was offered in return: a home, security, a fair and honest partnership. Clara had read it aloud to Louisa at the kitchen table one evening in the spring of 1882, and then she had folded it neatly and pressed it into Louisa's hand and said, "That's you. That is exactly you." Louisa had written to John Donovan in April of 1882. He had written back. Over the course of 6 weeks they had exchanged 5 letters each, and the letters had been businesslike and careful, but there had been something in them, some quality of directness and quiet intelligence on his part, that had made Louisa feel seen in a way she had not expected. He had asked her real questions, not about her appearance or her domestic skills, but about what she believed in, what she feared, what she had read, and what had moved her. And she had answered him honestly, because she had nothing to lose. He had agreed formally to receive her in August of 1882, and they would decide together at that point whether to proceed. It was the most reasonable offer anyone had ever made to Louisa Hart, and she had accepted it. And then on the 14th of June, Clara had gotten sick. It had started as a cough, the kind that everyone gets in early summer, the kind that passes in a week. But it did not pass. It settled in Clara's lungs and turned hot and stubborn, and by the end of June Clara could not rise from her bed, and by the middle of July Louisa knew, though she could not say it aloud, that her sister was dying. She had not left. How could she have left? Clara was her whole world, the person who had mothered her and laughed with her and believed in her when no one else had thought to. She stayed and she nursed Clara through the worst of it, cooling her fever with wet cloths, spooning broth between her cracked lips, reading to her from the books they had both loved. Clara died on the 3rd of August, 1882, 1 week after Louisa had been supposed to depart for New Mexico territory. The grief had been enormous and quiet, like a deep winter freeze that locks everything solid. Louisa had buried her sister in the churchyard next to their mother, and had sat with the fact of her own complete aloneness for the better part of a week. She had no other family. Her father had died 3 years earlier. She had acquaintances in Columbus, women from church, neighbors who brought food and patted her hand, but no one who truly knew her. No one who had needed her or been needed by her the way Clara had. She had looked around the small house that had been her father's and had seen nothing in it but the shape of everyone she had lost. She had thought about John Donovan's letters, which she had kept tied in a ribbon in her mother's sewing box. She had thought about the advertisement, capable, honest, willing to work hard. She had packed a saddlebag. She had sold the house and everything in it that she could not carry, and she had taken the money and bought a train ticket to Kansas City and a horse from a livery there, and she had turned her face west because the only direction that held any possibility at all was forward. She had been traveling for 9 weeks when the letter caught up with her in Dodge City, forwarded by her neighbor Mrs. Ames, who had found it sitting on Louisa's former doorstep 3 days after she had gone. It was from John Donovan. It was brief. It informed her that circumstances had changed and he wished to withdraw his proposal and thanked her for her interest. It gave no further explanation. Louisa had stood in the middle of the main street of Dodge City, Kansas, in the middle of September, 1882, and read that letter 3 times. And then she had folded it into her pocket and gotten back on her horse and kept riding west, because she had already sold everything she owned, buried everyone she loved, and crossed 800 miles of open country, and she had nowhere else to go. She was going to Sweetwater Creek, New Mexico territory, and she was going to stand in front of John Donovan and look him in the eye and find out what she was walking into. She had not expected the gun. Standing now in his front room, with the gun lowered and the letter still in her outstretched hand and the weight of all of it pressing down on her shoulders, Louisa said, "I had no way to turn back because I had sold everything I owned. This bag is all I have in the world. I came because I had already decided to come, and because stopping halfway seemed worse than finishing. And because your letters told me you were an honest man, and I wanted to find out if that was true before I decided what to do next." John Donovan stood very still for a moment. Then he uncocked the gun and set it on the mantel above the fireplace. He turned back to face her. "Why did I have a gun on you?" he said, and it was not quite a question. "I assumed someone had tried to come onto your land," Louisa said. "There's a man who's been trying to take this ranch from me for the better part of a year," John said. "He sent people before. Some of them have been women." "I am not one of his people," Louisa said. "I can see that now," John said, and something in his voice had shifted, Something had gone quieter and more careful, like a man walking towards something he is not sure will hold his weight. He looked at her again, slower this time. She let him look. She was not ashamed of what the road had done to her. She was exactly what she appeared to be, a woman who had crossed the country on her own with nothing but her wits and her determination and a destination she had committed to. "You're hungry," he said finally. "I am very hungry," Louisa said, "and you need a place to sleep." "I do. And you came here to find out if my letters were honest." "Yes." He ran a hand through his dark hair and looked at the ceiling for a moment as if asking the rafters for some kind of guidance. Then he looked back at her. "I'll tell you why I sent the withdrawal letter," he said, "and then you can decide whether you want to stay or go. That's fair." "That's fair," Louisa agreed. He gestured toward a wooden chair at a rough-hewn table near the kitchen, and Louisa sat down, and John Donovan put a pot of coffee on the iron stove and began to talk. The ranch had been his father's before it was his. Robert Donovan had come out to New Mexico Territory in 1858, when John was 3 years old, had broken land and built a house and raised cattle through Indian raids and drought and the long chaos of the Civil War years and the lawlessness that followed. He had died in 1878, leaving John, then 23, with 400 acres of rangeland, 300 head of cattle, a mortgage, and a deep and complicated inheritance. John had worked hard. He had paid down the mortgage. He had expanded the herd to nearly 500 head by 1881. He had hired 2 good ranch hands, men he trusted, and he had built the operation into something solid and self-sustaining. But he had been doing all of it alone, and the loneliness of it had become a kind of weight he carried without speaking about it, because there was no one to speak to. He had placed the advertisement not only because he needed help running the household, but because he was, at 27 years old, tired of the silence. He wanted a person in his house, a real one, someone with a mind and a voice and an honest presence. Louisa's letters had been unlike anything he had expected. They had been direct and unadorned and occasionally funny, and they had spoken with a plainness about loss and hope that had moved him more than he knew how to say. He had looked forward to her arrival with a feeling that embarrassed him in its intensity. And then, in the second week of August, a man named Harlan Cole had ridden onto his land. Harlan Cole was a land speculator from Santa Fe who had been acquiring properties throughout the Sweetwater Creek Valley for the past 2 years, building up a block of land he intended to sell to the railroad company that was extending its line westward through New Mexico Territory. The Donovan Ranch sat directly in the path of the most valuable route. Cole had offered John a price that was fair on paper, but that John knew, from the conversations of other ranchers in the valley, was considerably below what the railroad would eventually pay. John had refused. Cole had then made a second offer, higher than the first. John had refused again. And then, on the 15th of August, Cole had done something that John had not anticipated. He had hired a woman named Edith Moore, a sharp and persuasive woman from Santa Fe, to travel to Sweetwater Creek under the pretense of being a mail-order bride, responding to John's advertisement. Edith Moore had arrived at his ranch, charming and beautiful and carrying forged letters, and she had spent 4 days attempting to convince John that she was Louisa Hart, that she had come in good faith, and that she intended to marry him. Her actual purpose had been to get close enough to him, and to his legal documents, to find the deed to his property and either steal it or forge a transfer. John had discovered the deception on the 4th night, when he had gone to the barn late to check on a sick horse, and had found Edith Moore in his study with a lamp, and his strongbox open on the desk. She had left the ranch the following morning under circumstances that had made John feel, for the first time in his adult life, like a fool. After that, he had sent the withdrawal letter. He had decided he did not want to trust a stranger again, did not want the exposure, the vulnerability of bringing an unknown woman into his home when Harlan Cole was circling his property like a wolf around a winter-thin sheep. But he had sent the letter 2 days too late, as it turned out. Louisa listened to all of this without interrupting. The coffee was hot and bitter, and she wrapped both hands around the cup and felt the warmth of it travel up through her cold fingers. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, turning things over in her mind. "I understand," she said at last. "What happened to you was a genuine betrayal, and you had every reason to withdraw your trust. I don't blame you for that." "But," John said, because he could hear there was one. "But I am not Edith Moore," Louisa said. "I am Louisa Hart of Columbus, Ohio, and I can prove it. I have my father's Bible with my birth date recorded in it. I have 3 of your own letters in my bag that you addressed to me at my home address. I have a bill of sale from the Columbus City Bank showing the sale of my property in August of 1882 under the name Louisa E. Hart. And I have the name and address of my nearest neighbor in Columbus, a Mrs. Ames, who can write you a letter of verification if you give her 3 weeks for the post." She paused. "I am what I said I was. I came here in good faith. I have nothing to hide and nothing to offer except myself, which is exactly what your advertisement asked for." Something happened in John Donovan's face then. It was subtle, the way a landscape shifts when a cloud passes and the light changes, but it was unmistakable. Something that had been braced and guarded loosened slightly, and underneath it there was something that looked very much like relief. "You walked 14 miles, he said. "My horse went lame 3 days out," Louisa said. "I sold him to a farmer and walked. I had good directions from a man in town. 14 miles in those boots." Louisa looked down at her boots and back up at him. "They have seen better days," she agreed. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not a full smile. It was the beginning of one, restrained by the caution of a man who had recently been badly burned. But it was there, and Louisa saw it, and she filed it away in the part of herself where important things are kept. "There's a room at the back of the house," John said. "It was my sister's when she visited. You're welcome to use it tonight. Tomorrow we'll talk about what comes next." "Thank you," Louisa said, and she meant it with her whole exhausted heart. She slept for 12 hours and woke to the sound of cattle in the distance and the smell of coffee and something frying on the stove. She lay still for a moment in the clean, narrow bed and looked at the ceiling and tried to decide what to feel. She had arrived. She was here. She was safe and warm and fed, and the man in the next room was not what she had feared, which was good, and was more complicated than she had expected, which was also good in the way that complicated things are sometimes a sign that something real is at stake. She rose and dressed and went to the kitchen, where John was standing at the stove in a clean blue shirt, his dark hair still damp from washing, frying salt pork in a heavy iron skillet. He had already poured her a cup of coffee. He set a plate on the table when she came in without making a fuss about it, which she appreciated. "Your boots are beside the door," he said without looking up. "I cobbled them as best I could. It's not expert work, but it'll hold for a while." Louisa looked at her boots, resoled clumsily but firmly with a piece of cut leather, and felt something shift in her chest that was not entirely logical. "You did not need to do that," she said. "No," he agreed, and he did not say anything else about it, which was somehow exactly the right response. They ate breakfast mostly in silence, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who are both thinking hard and who respect each other enough not to fill the air with noise. After breakfast, John told her what the situation with Harlan Cole currently looked like. Cole had increased his pressure in the past month. He had gone to the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe and filed a claim contesting the legitimacy of the original Donovan land grant, arguing that Robert Donovan's 1858 acquisition had contained a surveying error that made the boundary description legally invalid. It was, John explained, almost certainly a fabricated challenge, but it required him to gather original documentation and hire a lawyer in Santa Fe, which took time and money. Cole had also been pressuring the 2 ranchers on either side of the Donovan property to sell, with the implicit suggestion that if John were isolated between 2 co-loan properties, the value of his land would diminish, and he would be forced to accept whatever Cole chose to offer. "He's been applying pressure from every angle," John said. "The false bride was just one part of it. He wanted access to my strongbox to steal or destroy my deed and the original survey documents. Without them, my claim in the land office becomes nearly impossible to prove quickly." "Do you still have the original documents?" Louisa asked. "Yes. I moved them the night I found Edith Moore in my study. They're in a location Cole doesn't know about." "Good," Louisa said. "And have you engaged a lawyer?" "I wrote to one in Santa Fe. He's reviewing the challenge. It takes time." "Time is what Cole is buying with all of this," Louisa said. "He's creating enough delay and uncertainty that the Railroad Commission makes its route decision while your ownership is still clouded. If the railroad commits to a route before your title is fully cleared, there may be legal complications with compensating you." John looked at her steadily. "You understand land claims." "My father was a schoolteacher, but he read law extensively. I grew up listening to him talk through legal problems with his friends. And I read everything I could find." She paused. "I'm not a lawyer, but I understand how these things work." "I think," John Donovan said slowly, like a man who is choosing his words with great deliberate care, "that I may have sent that withdrawal letter too soon." "I think you may have," Louisa said, and neither of them looked away, and the morning light came in through the kitchen window and fell across the rough table between them, and it felt, to both of them, like the beginning of something they had not dared name yet. The days that followed were busy in the way that frontier days always are, filled with work that does not pause for sentiment or hesitation. Louisa threw herself into it without reservation. She was not a woman who needed to be asked twice or instructed how to do things she already knew. She took over the kitchen and the house and brought both into an order that had clearly been lacking, not because John was careless, but because he was one person managing too many things at once, and the house had simply fallen behind. She mended things. She organized the larder. She helped with the horses when an extra hand was needed. She learned the names of the two ranch hands, a steady older man named Walt Greer who had worked for the Donovans for 8 years, and a younger man named Pedro Reyes whose family had been in the territory for 3 generations, and who knew the land the way you only know something that is part of your own blood. John watched her. He was not a man who watched carelessly. When John Donovan paid attention to something, it was the full weight of his attention, deliberate and quiet and thorough. He watched the way she talked to Pedro in her careful, formal Spanish that was clearly learned from books, but was trying hard to be respectful. He watched the way she was completely unafraid of the horses, moving around them with the easy confidence of someone who has been around animals all her life. He watched the way she read in the evenings, sitting close to the lamp with her feet tucked up under her on the chair in a way that was entirely uncalculated, entirely natural. He had not expected her to be like this. He had expected someone capable and decent, because her letters had suggested both. He had not expected someone who made his house feel, for the first time in years, like a place where a life was being lived rather than simply sustained. On the 4th evening he came in late from checking on a heifer that was close to calving, and he found Louisa sitting at the kitchen table with his ledgers open and a piece of paper in front of her covered in her precise, neat handwriting. She looked up when he came in, and she had the slightly guilty expression of someone who has overstepped and knows it. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. "I should have asked. I saw the ledgers on the desk and she stopped. "I found an error. In last year's cattle sales, I think you were underpaid by $17. John took his hat off and hung it on the peg and came to look at what she had found. She was right. The entry for the November cattle sale showed 312 head at $2.30 per head, but when she had done the multiplication it came out $17 short of what he had been paid and recorded. It was likely a simple arithmetic error, possibly made by the buyer at the time, possibly copied wrong by John when he recorded it. But it was real. "I'll take it to the cattle buyer in town," John said. "There is also this," Louisa said, and she pointed to a series of entries from the spring of 1882 that she had marked carefully. You have a pattern of selling your calves at the Sweetwater Creek auction, rather than holding them through the summer and selling them at the September market in Las Cruces. The September prices average 30 cents per head higher for yearlings than the spring prices in Sweetwater Creek. If you held half your spring calves through the summer, the increased revenue would offset the additional feed cost and leave you ahead by at least $50 per season. John sat down across from her and looked at what she had laid out. The math was clear and correct. He had never done it this way because he had simply always done it the other way, because that was how his father had done it, because changing a deeply established habit requires someone to show you from the outside what the habit is costing you. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked. "I kept our household accounts from the time I was 12, Louisa said. "After my mother died, my father was—" She paused. "He was a good man, but he was not particularly practical. Clara and I figured out that if we did not manage things carefully, things did not get managed." "What happened to Clara?" he asked quietly, and Louisa told him. She told him about the cough and the long, terrible weeks of August in the churchyard and the silence afterward. She told it plainly and without self-pity, but her voice changed when she spoke about her sister, became lower and more careful, the way you speak about something that is too precious to handle carelessly. John listened without interrupting. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the wind pushing against the walls and the distant low calling of the heifer in the barn. "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it the way honest people mean things without decoration. "It is why I was late," Louisa said, "in case you were wondering." "I had wondered," he said. "Your first letter after the first exchange came with a different handwriting. I thought something had happened." Louisa looked up quickly. "You noticed?" "I noticed everything you wrote," John said, and then he seemed to realize he had said more than he intended, and he looked down at the ledger, and a faint color rose along the edge of his jaw that had nothing to do with the heat of the stove. Louisa looked at that color and felt something warm move through her that she had not felt before, something that was separate from and more complicated than the simple practical alliance she had been building in her mind on the long road west. She looked away from it deliberately, filed it in that same careful interior place where she kept important things, and said, "I can help you with the accounts from now on if you would like. It seems like a useful contribution I can make while the other arrangements are—" She searched for the right word. "While things are being determined." "I would like that," John said. Yes. They had not yet spoken directly about marriage. They both knew it was the reason she was there. They both understood that the original arrangement had been a practical one, proposed by an advertisement and agreed to by correspondence, and that the arrival of a real person with a real history and real eyes and real opinions had made everything both simpler and more complex simultaneously. On the 7th day of Louisa's being at the ranch, Harlan Cole came to call. She was in the garden when she heard the horses, 4 of them, coming up the road from Sweetwater Creek at a pace that was not casual. She straightened and shaded her eyes and watched them come. Cole was easy to identify, a heavy-set man in his mid-40s with the particular bearing of a person who has been well-fed and well-served his entire life, and has mistaken this for a natural condition of his own superiority. He had 3 men with him who were not his ranch hands. Anyone could see that. They were the kind of men who ride for hire. John came out of the barn when he heard the horses, and Louisa watched the way his body changed when he saw who it was. He did not tense visibly, but there was a stillness that came over him, a deliberate kind of readiness that was more alert than calm. Cole pulled up in the yard and looked down at John from his horse, and then let his gaze slide to Louisa in a way that was meant to make her feel looked through rather than looked at. "Donovan," he said, "I see you've got company." "This is Miss Hart," John said. "She's living here." Cole's eyebrows moved slightly. He glanced at his men and then back at John. "Is she now? Well, that's an interesting development. I hope it won't complicate the business we need to discuss." "There's no new business between us, Cole," John said. "My answer is the same as it was." "The situation has changed," Cole said, and his voice was smooth and flat like a river that's running deep and fast under a still surface. The land office challenge has been escalated. I have 2 affidavits from surveyors stating that the original Donovan survey is invalid. The ruling will come down within the month, and when it does, the title to this property will be in legal limbo long enough to make the railroad look elsewhere. Then what you've got is 400 acres of questionable title in the middle of nowhere, worth considerably less than what I'm offering you now. Your surveyors are lying, John said, and his voice was as steady as the ground under his feet. That's a serious accusation, Cole said. It's a statement of fact, John said. Get off my land, Cole. Cole looked at Louisa again. You might want to advise your friend here to think carefully, he said to her pleasantly, as though they were having a civilized conversation in a sitting room somewhere. A man who can't see when the game is up tends to lose more than he needed to. I don't know much about games, Louisa said calmly, meeting his eyes without wavering. But I know something about forged legal documents and the penalties for presenting fraudulent affidavits in a territorial land court. If your surveyors have filed false statements, that is a criminal matter, not just a civil one. I would be careful about the word escalation if I were you. Cole stared at her for a moment. The pleasant surface cracked, just slightly, just enough for her to see what was underneath it, which was a man who was not accustomed to being answered back by a woman in a garden with dirt on her hands. You've got an interesting woman there, Donovan, he said at last, and turned his horse and rode back down the road with his men behind him. John waited until they were out of sight. Then he turned to look at Louisa, and the expression on his face was one she would carry with her for a long time, something that was startled and quietly fierce and warm all at the same time. That was either very brave or very foolish, he said. Probably both, Louisa said, but he needed to know that you are not alone here. There was a moment between them then, standing in the yard with the dry New Mexico sun overhead and the smell of dust and sage in the air, where everything that had been moving slowly and carefully between them accelerated just slightly. He was looking at her the way he had been looking at her for a week, with that full and deliberate attention, but something had been added to it now, something that was recognition. Louisa, he said, and the use of her name without the formal title for the first time was something she felt physically. Yes, she said. I want to ask you something directly, and I want to ask it because you deserve to know what I'm thinking, not because I'm putting any pressure on you. You can say no, or you can think about it, or you can tell me it's too soon and I will accept whatever you say. Ask, she said. Will you marry me? He said. Not because of the arrangement we made by letter. Because I think you are the most honest and capable. And he stopped. He looked away briefly and then back. Because you are not what I expected and you are better than what I hoped for, and because this house has felt like a different place since you came into it, and because I would like it very much if you stayed, not as a convenience or a solution to a problem, as my wife, as a real marriage if that's something you could want. Louisa Hart stood in the yard of the Donovan Ranch in the middle of New Mexico territory in the fall of 1882, with a saddlebag that was still the sum total of her worldly possessions sitting somewhere inside the house behind her. And she thought about the road she had traveled to get here, all 1,100 miles of it. The grief and the loneliness and the 14 miles on foot, and the gun in the doorway and the cobbled boots and the ledgers, and the way he had listened when she talked about Clara without trying to minimize or redirect or fix what could not be fixed. Yes, she said. I think that is something I could want. He did not sweep her into his arms. He was not that kind of man, not yet, not in the early days when things were still being built between them. He reached out and took her hand carefully, like it was something he wanted to hold well. His hand was large and rough and warm, and hers fit inside it in a way that felt completely natural and entirely new. All right, he said. All right, she agreed. They were married 2 weeks later in Sweetwater Creek, at the small white church on the main road, with Walt Greer and Pedro Reyes standing up for them, and the Reverend's wife acting as witness. Louisa wore her best dress, which was not particularly fine, but she had washed and pressed it carefully, and she wore her hair in a way that was simple and becoming. And when John saw her walk into the church, he stood very straight and very still, and something moved across his face that he made no attempt to conceal. It was a brief, honest ceremony. The Reverend read the words and they answered them clearly, and John Donovan slid a plain gold ring onto Louis's finger, his grandmother's ring, which he had kept in his strongbox for years. And when the Reverend said the part about kissing his bride, John turned to her and put one hand gently against her cheek and kissed her softly. And Louis's heart did something it had not done in so long that she had almost forgotten it was capable of it. They celebrated with a simple dinner at the hotel restaurant in town, the four of them, and Walt told a long story about Robert Donovan that made John laugh in the way that grief sometimes opens up into something like gratitude. And Pedro said a toast in Spanish that Louisa only partially understood, but that moved her anyway. And the evening was warm and easy, and full of a kind of contentment that felt earned in the way the best things are. And then they drove back to the ranch together in the falling dark, and the stars over New Mexico were so numerous and close that Louisa, who had grown up under the softer skies of Ohio, felt for a moment as though she had arrived somewhere entirely outside the ordinary world. "Are you all right?" John asked, watching her look up. "I was just thinking," Louisa said, "that I have never in my life seen so many stars." "You'll get used to them," he said. "I don't think I want to get used to them," she said. "I think I want them to always look like this." He looked at them too for a moment, these stars he had looked at for 27 years, and then he looked at her, and she could see in his face that he was seeing them slightly differently than he had before. The nights that followed were tender and careful and real, the nights of two people who are choosing each other deliberately, who are building something rather than falling into it. John was patient and attentive and honest, qualities that Louisa had thought she wanted in a husband and found, in practice, to be even more essential than she had understood. He never pretended to feel something he did not feel, and what he felt he expressed without drama and without concealment, and the combination of those two things created between them a safety that Louisa had not known she was hungry for until she had it. She told him things she had not told anyone, about the loneliness of her childhood, the way she and Clara had raised each other, about the books she had read and what she had taken from them, about the dark year after their father died, when she had kept herself going by sheer force of will because Clara had needed her too, about the particular texture of grief that comes when you lose the last person who truly knows you. John told her things in return, about his father, who had been a hard man in the way the frontier makes men hard, demanding and not particularly warm, but who had also shown his son something about endurance and care through the way he tended his land and his animals. About the years after his father's death, when he had felt the weight of the inheritance as something close to a burden, a set of obligations that had no room inside them for what he himself might want. About the slow recognition in his late 20s that he had been managing his life rather than living it. The days were full and demanding. The ranch kept them both busy from before sunrise until after dark. But there were evenings after the work was done, when they sat together on the porch in the cooling air and talked, or read in companionable silence, or John played the guitar he kept in the corner of the sitting room in a way that was rusty from disuse but real, the way things are real when no one is performing them. Louisa had not known she would love the land. She had expected to tolerate it, to make peace with it as the setting of the life she was choosing. She had not expected to feel, within a matter of weeks, a deep and visceral connection to this particular stretch of earth, the wide flat valley with its distant blue mountains and its enormous sky, and the way the light changed on the sage in the late afternoon, gold and rose, and then the deep purple of a New Mexico evening. She rode out with John on weekends, learning the boundaries of the ranch, the water sources and the grazing rotations and the seasonal patterns of the cattle. She had a natural seat on a horse, and he noticed it, praised it once in a way that was brief and genuine, and she felt herself flush with a pleasure that was partly pride and partly something more personal. The threat from Harlan Cole did not disappear with the wedding. If anything, it intensified. In October, the Santa Fe lawyer John had engaged sent word that the land office challenge was real and would require a formal response. The affidavits from Cole's surveyors were indeed fraudulent, as Louisa had suspected, but proving it required obtaining the original survey records from 1858, which were held in the territorial archives, and a counter-survey conducted by an independent surveyor to demonstrate that the Donovan boundaries were accurate. All of this cost money. More money than John had readily available, given that the ranch's revenue was tied up in the cattle season, and the next major payment would not come until the spring sale. Louisa sat with the ledgers, and she did not panic. She looked at what they had and what they needed, and she found a path through. She wrote a letter to the cattle buyer in Las Cruces about an advance against the spring sale, making the case for the quality of the Donovan herd with figures she had compiled from the past 3 years of records. She wrote to a bank in Santa Fe about a short-term note. She wrote to Mrs. Ames in Columbus and asked her to gather any correspondence she had from Louisa that might serve as documentation of her identity and her independent move west, to be forwarded to the lawyer in Santa Fe as supporting context for the Donovan case. She did all of this efficiently and without drama, laying it before John each evening as a set of options rather than as decisions she had made without him, because she understood intuitively that a man like John Donovan needed to be a partner in things, needed to have his own intelligence respected in the making of choices about his own life. "You are extraordinary," John said one evening, looking at the letter she had drafted to the Las Cruces cattle buyer. "I am practical," Louisa said. "Those are not mutually exclusive," he said, and he was looking at her with that direct, unguarded look that still had the power to catch her breath, and she felt the full force of what had grown between them in these weeks, something that had gone from hope and caution to something that felt, in moments like this one, entirely unguarded and irreversible. She set down her pen and looked back at him steadily. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I did not come here expecting to love you," she said. "I came here expecting to find a workable arrangement with a decent man. I want you to know the difference, because the arrangement has become something else and you should know that I know it." The kitchen was very quiet. The lamp made a warm gold circle around them. Outside, the night was enormous and full of stars. John got up from his chair and came around the table to her side, and he put his hands on her face, both of them, careful and certain, and he looked at her for a long moment before he said, "I fell in love with you somewhere between your second and third letter," he said. "When you wrote about the almanac and what it got wrong about the weather in Ohio and why. I have been trying to behave sensibly about it ever since." Louisa laughed, which surprised her, and then she put her hands over his hands and leaned her forehead against his and said, "You could stop trying to behave sensibly about it." "I think I could," he agreed. And then he kissed her, not carefully this time, not with the soft restraint of the church ceremony, but fully and honestly, the way a person kisses someone they have been waiting for and are finally, completely, willing to stop waiting. The case with Harlan Cole moved through the territorial legal system through the winter months. John traveled to Santa Fe twice, once to meet with the lawyer and once to give a deposition in the land office proceeding, and both times Louisa ran the ranch in his absence with a competence that earned her, quietly and permanently, the deep respect of Walt Greer, who was not a man who gave his respect easily. Pedro Reyes became, in this period, something close to a genuine friend to Louisa. He was 24 and sharp and funny, with a deep knowledge of the New Mexico landscape that he shared with her on the long rides they took together checking fence lines and monitoring the winter grazing. His family had lived in this territory since before it was a territory, when it had been part of Mexico, and before that the domain of the Pueblo peoples whose presence in this landscape went back centuries further than any of the recent arrivals, including the Donovans. Pedro talked about this matter-of-factly, without bitterness but without pretense either. The land had a history that went deeper than any single claim, he said, and the best a person could do was to be a good steward of it and to know what they were part of. Louisa listened and thought about this. It was not a perspective she had encountered much in Ohio, but it resonated with something in her sense of how the world worked, the understanding that context matters, that nothing exists in isolation, that a person's relationship to a place is shaped by everything that came before them in that place. She wrote some of this to John in a letter when he was in Santa Fe for his second trip, not to create a political argument, but because she wanted to share with him what she was thinking, because sharing what she was thinking had become one of the central pleasures of her life. He wrote back from Santa Fe a letter that was longer than any he had written her before, including the courtship letters, and he engaged with everything she had said directly and without defensiveness, and he told her that Pedro's family had been on this land longer than his own by far and that he had always understood this to be true, and that it shaped the way he thought about ownership and stewardship. At the bottom of the letter he had written, "I miss you in a way that is inconvenient for getting work done. Come and get me if I stay too long." Louisa had laughed until she cried, and then she had written back, "I will be there with the wagon if you are not home by Friday. The cattle miss you too, but I suspect less than I do." He was home by Thursday. In February of 1883, the Territorial Land Office issued its ruling. The coal affidavits were found to be fraudulent. The original Donovan survey was confirmed as valid. The boundaries of the ranch were declared legally sound, and the challenge was dismissed with a formal note in the record that the filing had been made in bad faith, which created the foundation for a potential criminal prosecution of the surveyors Cole had paid. Harlan Cole, when faced with this outcome and the possibility of a criminal investigation following from it, made a third and final offer for the Donovan Ranch, higher than his previous two, and was refused a third and final time. He departed Sweetwater Creek the following month and was not heard from again in the valley, having apparently redirected his attention to properties further north, where the railroad negotiations were more tractable. The evening after the legal ruling arrived by post, John and Louisa sat on the porch in the February cold, wrapped in blankets, watching the stars that were particularly brilliant that night in the clear winter air. "It's done," John said. "It is done," Louisa agreed. "You know that none of it would have gone the way it did without you," he said. Louisa considered this. "You would have found a way," she said. "The land and the legal case were solid. You would have defended them." "Maybe," he said, "but I would have been defending them alone, which is a very different thing from what actually happened." He turned to look at her. "You came here with one saddlebag and a destination, and you changed everything." "The destination was not exactly what I expected," Louisa said. "Was that a problem?" he asked, and there was something careful under the question, something that was still capable of being uncertain despite everything. She took his hand under the blanket. "No," she said. "It was considerably better than what I expected." Spring came to the Sweetwater Creek Valley like a slow unfurling, the sage greening and the cottonwoods along the creek coming into leaf, and the cattle moving to the summer grazing grounds with the assurance of creatures who know their landscape. The ranch was prospering. The spring cattle sale, held in Las Cruces in accordance with Louisa's advice about the September versus spring market timing, brought in revenue that paid off the short-term bank note and left a comfortable reserve for the operational costs of the year. Louisa had, somewhere in the course of the winter, made herself not just useful but essential to the workings of the ranch, not through calculation, but through the simple application of her considerable intelligence and her thoroughness to everything she put her hand to. She kept the books with a precision that saved them money they had not known they were losing. She managed the household with an efficiency that freed up time for other things. She wrote letters with a clarity and forcefulness that had won them the cattle advance, and navigated the relationship with the Santa Fe lawyer to a successful conclusion. But more than all of this, she and John had built between them something that Louisa had not dared to hope for in the original correspondence, something that she recognized now as the rarest and most valuable thing a life could contain: a true partnership. Not the kind where one person leads and the other follows, not the kind where roles are divided and separated, but the real kind, where two people with different strengths and the same fundamental values face the same direction and move through the world together. She had been afraid in the weeks after arriving that the depth of what she felt for him would make her vulnerable in a way she was not sure she could afford to be, given how much she had already lost. She had lost her mother and her father and her sister and her home, and the losses had been so enormous and so accumulative that she had wondered sometimes if she had the capacity left to survive another one. But what she had discovered in the daily intimacy of their life together was that love, the real kind, does not make you more vulnerable to loss. It makes you more capable of bearing it. It gives you a place to put the weight of it. It gives you someone to sit with in the dark without having to explain why the dark is so dark. In March, Louisa realized she was expecting a child. She had been cautiously certain for about 2 weeks before she told John, waiting until she was sure enough to say it aloud without the qualification of doubt. She told him on a Sunday morning when they were both still at the breakfast table, and she said it plainly because that was always her way. He went very still. Then the stillness broke open into an expression that she had never seen on him before, something that was so unguarded and full that it seemed to change the whole architecture of his face. "When?" he said. "Late September," she said. "October, perhaps." He got up from the table and came around to her side, and he knelt down beside her chair and took both her hands and looked at her with that complete, attentive look, and he said, "Are you all right? Are you feeling well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am better than I have been in years." He kissed her hands, both of them. "A child," he said, very quietly, as if saying it softly would protect it. "A child," she agreed. The spring and summer of 1883 were the best months of Louisa Hart Donovan's life, and she knew it as she was living them, which is not always how it works. She knew it the way you know a piece of music is beautiful while you are still hearing it, fully present in the quality of what is happening. She grew rounder and slower and more content as the summer deepened, and John was attentive without being fussing, which was exactly the right calibration for a woman who was constitutionally incapable of wanting to be treated as fragile. He rode out with her on slower horses through June and July, unwilling to let her go alone even though she was entirely capable. She did not object to his company, because the truth was that his company was one of the great pleasures of her existence, and the rides they took together in the long summer evenings, talking about everything and nothing, the ranch and the territory and the books they were both reading and the baby who was becoming real to them in more specific and daily ways, were something she would recall for the rest of her life with the precise intensity of things that mattered. Walt Greer's wife Emma came from the Greer homestead 5 miles down the valley to stay at the ranch in August, because she was a midwife of long experience, and her presence there added a quality of practical wisdom and warm humor to the household that Louisa appreciated deeply. Emma Greer was a large, capable, cheerful woman in her late 50s who had delivered more than 40 babies in this valley, and who viewed the whole business of childbirth with the confident serenity of a person who has seen most things go right most of the time. The baby came on the 1st of October, 1883, after a labor that was long and earnest, and followed by the particular quality of silence that precedes the first cry, the silence that is the most suspended moment in human experience. It was a boy. He was dark-haired like his father and had Louisa's gray eyes, and he was entirely himself from the first moment of his existence. And when John held him for the first time, standing at the bedroom window with the first pale light of October coming in over the mountains. Louisa watched her husband's face and knew, with the certainty of someone who has learned to read a person down to their foundations, that something in him that had been guarded for a very long time had finally, completely opened. "Robert," John said, without looking up from the baby's face, "after my father, if you're willing." "Robert," Louisa said, and she felt the weight of the generations in it, the way a name carries forward what has come before into what is being made now. "Yes, that is exactly right." The following years built themselves on the foundations they had laid. The Donovan ranch grew steadily through the 1880s, not dramatically but with the solid confidence of something well managed and properly understood. John expanded the herd incrementally and invested in the quality of the breeding stock, with the careful attention to long-term value that had always characterized his approach to the land. Louisa continued to manage the books and correspondence with the precision that had made the difference in the coal crisis. And she also, in 1885, began teaching a small school at the ranch for the children of neighboring families who had no access to formal education. The school started with 6 children and grew to 12 by 1887, and eventually the county took note of it and offered to support a proper schoolhouse, which was built on a piece of land John donated at the corner of the Donovan property nearest to the main road. The school became a kind of second project for Louisa, a way of doing in this new place what her father had done in Ohio, of putting knowledge and the love of learning into the world in a form that outlasted any individual effort. Robert grew into a sturdy, observant child who had his father's quietness and his mother's reading habit and a laugh that was entirely his own, sudden and whole and infectious. He followed John around the ranch from the time he could walk, learning the names of the horses and the cattle and the land features with the same intensity of attention that characterized both his parents. He also spent hours in the schoolroom at the tail end of his mother's teaching day, listening to lessons meant for children 3 years older than he was, and he absorbed them with a naturalness that made Louisa's heart ache pleasantly. In the spring of 1886, Louisa had a second pregnancy that ended very early, in the quiet, terrible way that some pregnancies do, and she and John navigated that loss together with the honesty and closeness that had by now become the defining quality of their relationship. There was grief, real and specific, and there was tenderness on his part that she did not have to ask for, and they talked about it on the porch on many evenings that spring, and it made them more rather than less, the way the honest acknowledgement of hard things always does between people who trust each other. A year later, in the summer of 1887, a daughter came. She was born in June with an abundance of Louisa's own reddish-brown hair, and from the beginning had a quality of fierce particularity about her that pleased both of her parents enormously. They named her Clara, for the woman whose laugh had once filled every room she entered, and whose practical fierceness had shaped the woman her sister had become. Clara Donovan entered the world with a healthy voice and an opinion about everything from her first week of existence, and Robert, who was 4 years old by then, accepted her with the particular equanimity of a child who has been well loved and is therefore not threatened by the arrival of more love. The summer Clara was born was also the summer the railroad came through the Sweetwater Creek Valley. The line went through in the summer of 1887, running east to west along the south side of the valley on a route that required it to cross the corner of 3 properties, including the Donovan Ranch. The railroad offered compensation for the right-of-way that was, as John had suspected 5 years earlier, considerably more generous than anything Harlan Coal had been offering. It was not a fortune, but it was enough to eliminate the remaining operating debt on the ranch and fund a significant improvement to the house, which had been perfectly functional, but had always lacked the space and comfort that a growing family and an active school required. John oversaw the construction of a proper extension to the east side of the house, adding 3 rooms and a covered porch that ran the full length of the new section. Louisa designed the interior of the new space with the same practical intelligence she brought to everything, arranging the rooms so that the largest one served as a proper sitting room and library. Because by 1887, they had accumulated enough books that the current shelving situation had become what she described as a genuine emergency. The day the construction was finished and the books were finally on proper shelves along the full length of one wall, Louisa stood in the middle of the new room and looked around at what had been built, the room and the house, and everything the house contained, and she felt something that went beyond satisfaction or contentment into a region that did not have an efficient word for it. John came in from outside and found her standing there, and he saw her face, and he came to stand beside her, and he looked at the room and then at her. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I was thinking about a saddlebag," she said. He understood immediately. He always understood immediately, which was one of the ongoing small daily miracles of their life together. "You came a long way," he said. "I did," she agreed. "And it turned out to be exactly the right distance." He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they stood together in the middle of the room they had built, in the middle of the life they had built, and outside the window the New Mexico sky was doing what it always did in the late afternoon, turning the whole world gold. Walt Greer retired from the ranch in 1888 and moved closer to town with Emma, whose health had begun to require more access to the doctor. John hired a young man named Thomas Bright to replace him, a 20-year-old from the Texas Panhandle who had heard there was good work at the Donovan ranch, and who turned out to be hardworking and honest and quick to learn. Pedro Reyes, by this point, had been with the ranch for 7 years and was effectively the foreman in all but name, managing the day-to-day operations with a competence and loyalty that John compensated generously because he understood the value of it. Louisa threw a proper Christmas celebration in 1888 that was the first time the house had been full of people all at once: Walt and Emma Greer and Pedro and his mother, who was a small, stout woman of great dignity who had come to regard Louisa with a warm and somewhat amused approval, and Thomas Bright, and the families of 4 of the schoolchildren who had nowhere else to be. The house, finally large enough for it, handled the crowd with ease, and the evening was the kind of evening that becomes a tradition through the simple fact of everyone wanting to repeat it. It did repeat, year after year, that Christmas gathering becoming the fixed point around which the social life of the Donovan Ranch organized itself, and Louisa presided over it each year with the particular quality she brought to everything she put her hand to, making it feel not like an orchestrated event, but like a natural gathering of people who belonged in the same place at the same time. Robert started at the proper school in Sweetwater Creek in 1889, riding in with his father on the days John went to town for supplies. And from the beginning it was clear that he was a child who loved learning with the same wholehearted commitment that his mother did. He read constantly, brought questions home to the dinner table that required both his parents to think carefully before answering, and showed an early particular interest in the natural sciences that would, in later years, lead him to the University of New Mexico and then further east to study. Clara was, by her 3rd year of life, a force of nature. She was fearless with the horses in a way that gave both her parents some anxious moments, independent in a way that was both exasperating and deeply pleasing, and possessed of a directness in speech that made both John and Louisa occasionally exchange a private look of recognition over her head. "Where does she get that from?" John said one evening, watching Clara firmly inform Robert that his reading of a particular story had been entirely wrong and that the correct reading was hers. "I cannot imagine," Louisa said, without inflection. John looked at her. "I see," he said. In 1890, when Robert was 7 and Clara was 3, Louisa discovered she was expecting again. This pregnancy went smoothly and full term, and in March of 1891 they had a second son. They named him Thomas William Donovan, William for Louisa's father and Thomas, because the name had been on both their lists and neither of them could say exactly why except that it suited the baby, which it did. Thomas was different from the beginning from his brother and sister. Where Robert was quiet and observant and Clara was fierce and particular, Thomas was expansive and social and joyful, the kind of child who laughs easily and loudly and who makes everyone around him feel included. He charmed everyone on the ranch from his first weeks of life, reaching out his small hands to whoever was nearest, investigating everything with a cheerful curiosity that gave his mother considerably more exercise than the first two had required. By 1891, the Donovan Ranch was recognized throughout the Sweetwater Creek Valley as one of the most successful and well-run operations in the region. The combination of John's skill with the cattle and his deep knowledge of the land and Louisa's management of the finances and accounts had created a foundation that could weather the natural disasters and economic fluctuations that claimed other ranches, and they had navigated 2 drought years and 1 brutal winter without losing either the herd or the financial stability that sustained the operation. The schoolhouse continued to grow. By 1891, Louisa had hired a second teacher, a young woman from Santa Fe named Margaret Flores, who took over the younger children and allowed Louisa to concentrate on the older students. The school's reputation had spread far enough that families were sending children from as far as 12 miles away, boarding them during the week with families near town, and riding home on Saturdays. Pedro Reyes married in 1891, a woman named Rosa from his mother's village, and John built them a proper house on the east pasture of the Donovan land as part of Pedro's compensation, which seemed to both parties entirely natural given how long Pedro had been as much a part of the ranch as anyone. The evening after Pedro's wedding, which was a celebration that lasted most of a day and involved more food and music than any occasion Louisa had previously attended, she and John sat on the new porch in the dark and listened to the last of the music drifting over from the bunkhouse where the dancing was still going on. "Do you remember," Louisa said, "the first morning, when you cobbled my boots?" "I remember everything about those first days," John said. "I remember thinking," she said slowly, "that there was something in that gesture, the boots, that told me who you were more clearly than all the letters had, because it was such a small thing and you did not make anything of it." "You had walked 14 miles, he said. "So you repaired my boots," she said. "Yes, that was exactly it." He reached over and took her hand in the dark, the way he had been reaching for her hand for 9 years, and she thought about the girl she had been, standing in a kitchen in Columbus, Ohio, reading an advertisement about a ranch in New Mexico territory, trying to imagine what a life might look like that was made rather than inherited. She thought about 1,100 miles of open country and a shallow grave in Kansas, and a rattlesnake, and a broken saddle, and 14 miles on foot, and a gun in a doorway. She thought about the way the gun had been lowered. She thought about the coffee that had been set on the stove. She thought about everything that had grown from those 2 small gestures, the lowered gun and the hot coffee, the first 2 facts of this man's hospitality and the beginning of everything that had come after. "John," she said. "Yes," he said. "I would like you to know," she said, "that I am entirely happy, not in a way that needs qualifying or comparing to anything, just straightforwardly, comprehensively happy. I want you to know that because you are the principal reason for it, and you deserve to know what you've made." The music from the bunkhouse rose briefly and then settled. The stars over New Mexico were as numerous and close as they had been on the first night she had looked up at them and could not speak for the abundance of them. John Donovan brought her hand to his lips and held it there for a moment before he said, "I wrote that advertisement wanting a capable woman," he said. "Someone practical, someone honest. I did not know what I was asking for when I asked for that. I did not understand that capable and honest in a person who has also chosen to love you is the most extraordinary thing in the world." "I came with nothing," Louisa said quietly. "You came with everything," John said. "You just hadn't unpacked it yet." She laughed, and the laugh was full and real in the summer dark, and he laughed with her, and the music played on, and the stars held steady in their enormous abundance, and the children slept in their beds inside the house that had been built from hard work and hard winters and the decision, made by a woman with a saddlebag and a destination, and a willingness to go all the way toward whatever was waiting. The years continued their steady accumulation. Robert left for the university in Albuquerque in 1900, when he was 17, having consumed every book the Sweetwater Creek School could offer, and many more that his parents had ordered for him from bookshops in Santa Fe. He studied natural science and was, by all accounts, a student of exceptional ability, and the day they saw him off on the train was one of those days that contains both the fullness of pride and the ache of change, the knowledge that the proper completion of what you have raised is its departure toward its own full life. Clara, at 13, watched her brother's train leave the station and turned to her parents with an expression of fierce calculation that told both of them she was already planning her own departure at the appropriate time. She was, by adolescence, exactly what she had always promised to be: brilliant, particular, utterly her own person, and armed with the combination of her mother's intelligence and her father's steadiness, and something entirely individual that she had arrived with herself. Thomas, at 9, was primarily interested in whether there would be cake at the send-off supper. The school in Sweetwater Creek had become, by the turn of the century, a genuine institution, supported by the county and staffed by 3 teachers, one of whom had trained partly under Louisa herself. Margaret Flores had become in the intervening years something between a colleague and a close friend, and the two of them had spent countless evenings discussing education and the particular challenges and rewards of teaching children who were growing up at the intersection of several cultures and traditions: the Anglo settlers, the long-rooted Mexican families, the Pueblo communities whose children occasionally came to the school, and whose presence Louisa had actively sought because it seemed to her, as it had since her conversations with Pedro years earlier, that the full truth of this place included everyone who had made it what it was. In 1901, John turned 46 and began to speak of the future of the ranch in terms that acknowledged his own mortality in a way that was neither morbid nor evasive, the practical acknowledgement of a man who has always been clear-eyed about the realities of life. He talked with Louisa about what should happen to the land, about whether Robert would want to return to it after his studies, or whether a different arrangement should be planned. He talked with Pedro, whose own children were now old enough to have interests and capacities of their own. These were good conversations, full of the kind of serious and honest consideration that the topic warranted. Louisa participated in them with the same engaged practicality she brought to everything, but she also said, at one point, that she would like not to think of the ranch as something to be planned for after they were gone, because she intended to be there for a very long time yet, and John agreed with this entirely. Robert came home from the university in the summer of 1902, having completed his degree, and having accepted a position as a naturalist assistant with a survey expedition into the southern New Mexico mountains. He was tall and dark-haired and had become, in his years away, entirely himself in the way that time and education and distance sometimes complete a person. He spent 6 weeks at the ranch that summer, riding out with his father every day, learning the land again with adult eyes. On one of those evenings, sitting on the porch with his parents in the cool July air, Robert said, "I want you to know that I understand what you built here, both of you, and that I don't take it lightly." Louisa looked at her son, this person who had been the first fruit of everything she and John had made together, and felt the particular gratitude of a parent who has raised a child who is capable of honesty and generosity simultaneously. "We take it lightly," John said. "It is what makes it sustainable." Robert laughed, and it was his grandfather's laugh, according to Walt Greer, who was old now and came to visit sometimes. That big rolling laugh that was entirely unrestrained. And hearing it, Louisa felt the generations of it. The way a family is a kind of conversation between the living and the dead, each generation speaking back to what came before them. Clara left for the normal school in Santa Fe in 1904. At 17, having made the case for her own departure with the devastating logical precision that she had been refining her whole life. And Louisa let her go with a full heart, because there was nothing else to do when a daughter has become completely herself, except stand back and witness her. Thomas, who was 13 by then and growing fast toward what would be a considerable height, took the departure of his siblings with characteristic good humor, and spent the increased quiet of the ranch applying himself to learning everything John knew about cattle management. Because Thomas had decided early on that his future was here on this land, in this valley, with these horses and this sky. John saw this in him and taught him everything he knew, with the patience and thoroughness of a man who understands that what he passes down is as important as what he built. He and Thomas rode out together in the mornings and talked through the decisions of the ranch the way John had once talked through the accounts with Louisa, as a collaborative process rather than an instruction, and watching them come in from the range in the late afternoon, talking and easy in each other's company, Louisa felt a warmth that lived somewhere beneath and beyond happiness, in the region where the deepest satisfactions take up residence. The 20th century arrived with its various changes, and the frontier began to close around the edges in the way that frontiers do, law and settlement and commerce reaching in and organizing what had been wild. The New Mexico Territory moved toward statehood, which arrived in 1912, and the changes that came with it were felt in Sweetwater Creek as they were felt everywhere. Louisa watched these changes with the engaged interest she brought to everything, and wrote about them in the long letters she exchanged with Robert, who was based in Albuquerque by then, and had become a respected naturalist with several published surveys to his name, and with Clara, who had completed the normal school and had gone further, to the university in Albuquerque like her brother, and was studying law with an intensity that made Louisa both proud and completely unsurprised. The Donovan ranch endured through all of it. The land held and the cattle thrived and the books on the shelves continued to accumulate, and the school in Sweetwater Creek continued to send children into the world with the love of learning that Louisa had seeded in it 25 years earlier. On a September morning in 1905, Louisa woke early while John still slept and went out onto the porch alone in the cool pre-dawn dark. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, the mountains becoming visible first as a darker darkness against the dark sky, and then, slowly, as the particular blue shapes she had known for more than 20 years. She was 50 years old. She had come to this place at 26 with one saddlebag and a folded letter in her pocket, and the particular stubborn hope of a woman who has lost everything, and is unwilling to believe that loss is the final word. She thought about Clara, her sister, the first Clara, the one who had pressed the advertisement into her hand and said, "That is exactly you." She thought about her father reading law books by lamplight. She thought about the 1,100 miles of road and the rattlesnake and the broken saddle and the 14 miles on foot. She thought about a gun being lowered. She thought about cobbled boots. She thought about ledgers and letters and a child's first cry, and a roomful of Christmas music and Pedro's wedding, and a long-ago July evening, when she had told John Donovan she had not come here expecting to love him, and had said it because he deserved to know that she did. The door behind her opened and she heard him come out, the particular rhythm of his footsteps that she would know in the dark anywhere, and he came to stand beside her, and they looked at the lightening sky together without speaking for a while, the way they had learned to be silent with each other, the way you are silent with the earth, fully present and fully at ease. "What are you thinking about?" he said finally. "The road," she said. He knew which road. He always knew. Was it worth it, he said, and it was not a real question because they both knew the answer, but sometimes it is good to say a thing that is already known. Louisa Hart Donovan stood on the porch of the house she had helped build, in the valley she had helped tend, looking at the mountain she had looked at for 23 years, with her children grown and her school running and the man she loved standing at her shoulder. "I would walk every mile of it again," she said, "in worse boots." He put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, and the sun came up over the mountains in the way it does in New Mexico, all at once and fully, filling the whole sky with gold, and it lit the valley and the sage and the far-off shapes of the cattle on the summer range, and it lit the white walls of the schoolhouse at the corner of the property, and it lit the faces of the two people on the porch who had made all of it together. From 2 letters and 1 saddlebag, and the decision to keep going forward when going back was no longer an option. And if you had asked either of them in that moment whether they had arrived at the destination they had been heading toward, they would both have said yes. But they would also have said that the destination had turned out to be not a place at all, but a person, and a life made with that person, and the daily choice to keep making it. Which is the oldest story in the world, and the one that never gets old, no matter how many miles it has traveled to get to its ending?